My name is Thomas, and I am 73 years old. For over 2 decades, I served as an elder in the Harmony Valley congregation, a position I held with pride and dedication that consumed the better part of my adult life. If someone had told me 5 years ago that I would be sitting here today, removed from all my responsibilities, shunned by the community I devoted my entire existence to, and sleeping peacefully for the first time in decades, I would have called them delusional. Yet here I am. And this is the story of how one confession shattered not only my faith in the organization I served, but forced me to confront the difference between institutional loyalty and genuine righteousness. It was a crisp October evening in 2019 when everything began to unravel. The regular Thursday night meeting had concluded as usual, with the familiar routine of handshakes, brief conversations about spiritual progress, and the gradual emptying of our modest kingdom hall. I had just finished organizing the literature when Brother Julian approached me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Julian was relatively new to our congregation, having transferred from the Riverside Assembly about 8 months prior due to his work relocation. He was a quiet man in his early 40s, always impeccably dressed, always punctual, always volunteering for the less glamorous tasks that kept our congregation running smoothly. His dedication reminded me of myself when I was younger, hungry to prove my worthiness and climb the spiritual ladder within the organization. "Brother Thomas," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "could I speak with you privately? It's quite urgent." The tremor in his hands was unmistakable, and I could see perspiration forming on his forehead despite the cool evening air. Something about his demeanor immediately put me on alert. In my years of shepherding the flock, I had encountered countless situations requiring pastoral care, confessions of moral failures, family crises, spiritual doubts, financial troubles. I had developed what I believed was a keen sense for reading people, and everything about Julian's body language screamed that this conversation would be far from ordinary. We made our way to the small counseling room at the back of the hall, a cramped space furnished with 2 chairs and a small table where elders conducted private meetings with congregation members. The fluorescent light flickered occasionally, casting intermittent shadows across the pale blue walls, decorated only with a single painting of Jesus teaching his disciples. I had sat in this room hundreds of times over the years, listening to tearful confessions, offering scriptural counsel, and helping fellow believers navigate the complexities of living according to biblical principles. Nothing had prepared me for what I was about to hear. Julian sat across from me, his hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. For several minutes he stared at the floor, opening his mouth as if to speak, then closing it again. I had learned patience in these moments, understanding that some burdens require time to surface. Finally, he looked up at me with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of years of suppressed anguish. "Brother Thomas, what I'm about to tell you will change everything. I've carried this secret for over 15 years, and it's destroying me from the inside. I can't eat, I can't sleep, I can't concentrate during meetings. Every time I see certain faces in our circuit assemblies, every time I hear certain names mentioned with reverence and respect, I feel physically ill. I need to tell someone, and I trust you." His words sent a chill down my spine. In all my years of pastoral experience, I had never heard such a desperate preamble to a confession. My mind immediately began racing through possibilities. What could possibly be so devastating that it would affect him so profoundly after all these years? Had he committed some terrible sin? Was he struggling with forbidden relationships? Had he been living a double life? "Julian," I said gently, "whatever burden you're carrying, remember that Jehovah is merciful and forgiving. The organization has procedures to help brothers and sisters work through any difficulties they might be facing. You can trust me to handle whatever you need, to share with discretion and love." He shook his head violently. "This isn't about me, Brother Thomas. Well, not directly. This is about something I witnessed, something I was forced to participate in, something that goes against everything we claim to stand for. And it involves someone who is highly respected in our organization, someone who continues to hold positions of tremendous authority and influence. My stomach began to knot. In my experience, accusations against prominent brothers were incredibly serious matters that required careful handling and extensive documentation. False accusations could destroy reputations and divide congregations, while legitimate concerns about leadership misconduct could shake the very foundations of faith for entire communities of believers. Brother Julian, if you're alleging misconduct by someone in authority, you understand that such matters must be handled very carefully. We need to be absolutely certain of facts before proceeding with any accusations. Can you tell me specifically what you witnessed? His hands began shaking more violently, and tears started forming in his eyes. 15 years ago, I was serving at the Clearwater congregation. Brother Daniel Morrison was our circuit overseer at the time, a man universally respected for his passionate talks, his deep scriptural knowledge, and his apparent devotion to shepherding God's people. Everyone looked up to him. The elders sought his advice on every important matter. Young brothers wanted to be like him. He seemed to embody everything we aspired to as servants of Jehovah. I knew Brother Morrison well. He had since been promoted to district overseer and was considered one of the most influential leaders in our region. His talks at conventions were always well attended, his biblical insights frequently quoted by other elders, and his reputation for spiritual maturity was virtually unquestioned. The mention of his name in connection with whatever Julian was about to reveal filled me with dread. "Continue," I said quietly, though every instinct told me I didn't want to hear what came next. "There was a 13-year-old boy in our congregation named Marcus. Bright kid, eager to please, from a single-parent household. His mother worked 2 jobs to support them, so Marcus spent a lot of time at the Kingdom Hall, helping with maintenance, organizing literature, basically becoming everyone's unofficial little helper. Brother Morrison took a special interest in him, said he wanted to mentor the boy, help him develop spiritual maturity early in life." Julian paused, wiping his eyes with his sleeve. At first, everyone praised Brother Morrison for his attention to the boy. Here was a busy circuit overseer taking time to personally guide a fatherless child. It seemed like such a beautiful example of Christian love and shepherding. Marcus's mother was grateful beyond words that such an important man would invest in her son's spiritual development. The direction of this story was becoming horrifyingly clear, and I felt my own hands beginning to tremble. "Julian, please tell me this isn't going where I think it's going." "I wish I could, Brother Thomas. I wish I could tell you that my fears were unfounded, that my suspicions were the product of an overactive imagination. But what I'm about to share with you is based on direct observation, on physical evidence, and on the confession of Brother Morrison himself when he was finally confronted." The room seemed to grow smaller, the air thicker. 23 years of absolute faith in the organization's moral authority, of unwavering belief in the righteousness of our leaders, of complete trust in the systems designed to protect our most vulnerable members. Everything I had built my adult identity around was beginning to crumble before Julian had even finished his account. Julian took a deep breath and continued, his voice growing steadier, as if finally releasing this burden was giving him strength. "I was serving as the literature coordinator at the time, which meant I often stayed late at the hall, organizing publications and preparing materials for the following week's meetings. On 3 separate occasions over a 2-month period, I arrived earlier than expected and noticed Brother Morrison's car still in the parking lot well after evening meetings had concluded. The lights were on in the back office, and I could hear voices inside. The first time, I assumed he was conducting some sort of extended pastoral meeting with one of the elders, so I went about my business quietly, not wanting to interrupt important congregation matters. He paused, running his hands through his hair in obvious distress. The second time, I realized one of the voices belonged to Marcus. It seemed odd that a 13-year-old would be involved in what I presumed were administrative discussions, but Brother Morrison had mentioned his special mentoring relationship with the boy, so I convinced myself it was part of his spiritual guidance program. But something about the tone of the conversation bothered me. There were long periods of silence, followed by what sounded like muffled protests or crying. When I knocked on the office door to announce my presence, there was a scramble of activity before Brother Morrison emerged, adjusting his clothing and looking flustered in a way I had never seen before. My chest tightened as the implications became undeniable. "What did you see when the door opened?" Marcus was sitting in the corner, his shirt buttoned incorrectly, tears streaming down his face, but Brother Morrison immediately began explaining that they had been discussing some personal family problems that were causing the boy emotional distress. He said Marcus was struggling with his absent father and needed intensive counseling to help him develop proper masculine identity. At the time, his explanation seemed plausible. Single-parent households were always a concern in our community, and the organization frequently emphasized the importance of strong male role models for fatherless children. Julian's voice cracked as he continued. But the third incident shattered any possibility of innocent explanation. I'd forgotten my keys and returned to the hall around 10:30 at night. The building should have been completely empty, but I saw lights on in the back conference room. I used my spare key to enter quietly, planning to retrieve my forgotten items and leave without disturbing anyone. As I walked toward the literature storage area, I heard sounds coming from the conference room that made my blood run cold. He stopped speaking for several moments, his entire body shaking with the memory. I wanted to stop him, to tell him that I had heard enough, that some knowledge was too terrible to bear. But I knew that once this confession had begun, it needed to reach its conclusion. Too many years of silence had already passed. I heard Marcus crying, pleading, saying, "Please stop, and I want to go home." I heard Brother Morrison's voice, much deeper and more commanding than his usual pastoral tone, telling the boy to be quiet, that this was part of his spiritual training, that mature Christian men needed to learn certain lessons. I stood frozen outside that door for what felt like an eternity, my mind refusing to process what was obviously happening just a few feet away from me. The fluorescent light above us flickered more dramatically, as if the building itself was reacting to the horror being revealed within its walls. I realized I was holding my breath and forced myself to exhale slowly. "What did you do?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. I panicked, Brother Thomas. I was 28 years old, a relatively new elder, facing a situation that challenged everything I believed about our organization and its leadership. I convinced myself that I must be misunderstanding what I was hearing, that there had to be some innocent explanation for sounds that seemed so damning. So I left. I went home, and I tried to forget what I had witnessed. The shame in his voice was palpable, but forgetting proved impossible. Over the following weeks, I watched Marcus carefully during meetings and congregation activities. His behavior had changed dramatically. He was withdrawn, anxious, reluctant to participate in activities he had previously enjoyed. He stopped volunteering for tasks around the hall, avoided being alone with any of the brothers, and seemed to jump at unexpected sounds or movements. His mother mentioned to several sisters that he was having nightmares and had begun wetting his bed again, something he hadn't done since he was much younger. I felt sick. Every detail Julian described painted a picture that was becoming increasingly impossible to deny or rationalize away. Did you ever try to speak with Marcus directly? I tried, but he was terrified. One afternoon, when his mother was in field service, I found him sitting alone in the parking lot after a meeting, staring at the ground with that same haunted expression I had seen too often. I sat beside him and gently asked if everything was okay. if there was anything troubling him that he wanted to talk about. He looked at me with these wide, scared eyes and said, "Brother Morrison says that if I tell anyone about our special meetings, Jehovah will be angry with me and my mum will lose her position in the congregation." Then he begged me not to tell anyone that he had said anything. Julian wiped tears from his cheeks before continuing. That's when I knew for certain that my worst fears were justified. A 13-year-old child doesn't fabricate those kinds of specific threats about organizational consequences. Brother Morrison was using the boy's love for his mother and his fear of disappointing Jehovah to ensure his silence about whatever abuse was taking place during those private mentoring sessions. The weight of what I was hearing pressed down on me like a physical force. In my 23 years as an elder, I had dealt with various forms of misconduct within the congregation, but nothing had prepared me for allegations of this magnitude against someone of Brother Morrison's stature and influence. The organizational hierarchy demanded absolute respect for circuit overseers, treating them as direct representatives of the governing body's authority. Accusations against such figures required extraordinary evidence and could potentially destroy entire careers and reputations if handled improperly. Julian, these are incredibly serious allegations. If what you're telling me is true, then we're dealing with criminal behavior that must be reported to proper authorities immediately. But I need to understand what happened next. Did you ever confront Brother Morrison directly? Did you report this to other elders or to the branch office? His expression grew even more pained. I tried, Brother Thomas. I spent sleepless nights praying for guidance, studying scriptures about protecting the innocent and confronting wrongdoing among God's people. Finally, I gathered enough courage to request a private meeting with Brother Morrison himself. I figured that if I was misunderstanding the situation, he could provide explanations that would put my concerns to rest. If my suspicions were correct, perhaps direct confrontation would stop the abuse and lead to genuine repentance. Before I let you continue, I need to pause here and ask you something that's been weighing on my heart throughout this entire conversation. Those of you who are listening to this story, I wonder if you've ever found yourself in situations where you witnessed something that challenged everything you believed about institutions or people you trusted completely. Have you ever faced moments where speaking up would cost you everything you had worked for, but staying silent would compromise your very soul? If my story is resonating with any of your own experiences, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Sometimes the most healing thing we can do is realize we're not alone in these impossible choices. And if you're finding value in me sharing this difficult chapter of my life, would you consider subscribing to this channel? Not because I need the numbers, but because I believe these conversations matter, and I want to create a space where we can all process these complex experiences together. Your support means more than you know, especially during times when sharing these truths feels both necessary and terrifying. Julian's account of his direct confrontation with Brother Morrison revealed layers of institutional corruption that I was unprepared to comprehend. He arranged the meeting under the pretense of seeking spiritual guidance about his growing responsibilities in the congregation, knowing that Morrison would be unable to refuse such a request without appearing uncooperative. They met at a small coffee shop several miles from the Kingdom Hall, a neutral location where Julian hoped to feel more confident about addressing such a sensitive matter with someone so far above him in the organizational hierarchy. Brother Morrison arrived exactly on time, as always, carrying his leather portfolio and wearing that warm, pastoral smile that had charmed countless congregations throughout his career, Julian recalled. For the first 20 minutes, we discussed routine congregation matters, upcoming circuit assembly preparations, and my personal spiritual goals. He seemed genuinely interested in my development as an elder, offering encouragement and practical advice about balancing family life with increased organizational responsibilities. I almost lost my nerve completely, wondering if I had misinterpreted everything I had witnessed. But Julien pressed forward, knowing that his conscience would never allow him peace if he remained silent. He began carefully, mentioning his concern for Marcus and asking about the special mentoring program that Morrison had established with the boy. Initially, Morrison's response seemed perfectly reasonable, explaining his burden for fatherless children and his desire to provide positive male influence during crucial developmental years. He spoke eloquently about the biblical mandate to care for orphans and widows, citing specific scriptures about the congregation's responsibility toward vulnerable members. "Then I took the plunge," Julien continued. "I told him about my concerns regarding the late-night meetings, the changes in Marcus's behavior, and my observations about the boy's obvious distress following their private sessions. I tried to frame everything as genuine worry for a child's well-being, rather than direct accusations, hoping to give him an opportunity to provide innocent explanations for what I had witnessed." Morrison's demeanor transformed instantly. The warm, grandfatherly expression vanished, replaced by cold calculation and barely controlled anger. He leaned forward across the small table, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper as he demanded to know exactly what Julien thought he had seen and heard. When Julien began to provide specific details about the incidents he had witnessed, Morrison's facade crumbled completely. "He didn't even attempt to deny what I was describing," Julien said, his voice heavy with remembered shock. Instead, he began explaining how certain aspects of mentoring young men required methods that outsiders might misunderstand. He said that boys from broken homes needed firm guidance and sometimes uncomfortable lessons to develop proper masculine identity. He actually quoted scriptures about not sparing the rod and about the necessity of discipline in spiritual development. The manipulation was breathtaking in its audacity. Morrison presented himself as a misunderstood servant of God, whose unconventional but necessary methods were being criticized by someone lacking the spiritual maturity to comprehend advanced pastoral techniques. He implied that Julien's concerns reflected personal weakness and insufficient trust in organizational wisdom. Most chillingly, he began questioning Julien's motives for spying on private counseling sessions and suggested that such behavior indicated serious spiritual problems that might require formal correction. "Then he said something that haunts me to this day," Julien continued. "He looked directly into my eyes and said, 'Brother Julien, you seem to be struggling with rebellious thinking that could be very dangerous for your spiritual health and your position in the congregation. I'm willing to overlook your inappropriate surveillance and accusations this time, but any further questioning of my methods or spreading of rumors about my work with young people will force me to recommend that the body of elders examine your fitness for continued service. The organization protects its loyal servants from troublemakers who threaten unity and peace." The threat was unmistakable. Morrison was using his position of authority to silence potential exposure, while simultaneously suggesting that Julien's concerns themselves constituted disloyalty, requiring disciplinary action. It was a masterful manipulation that transformed the accuser into the accused, making Julien question whether speaking up would result in his own destruction rather than protection for Marcus. But Morrison wasn't finished. He spent the next 30 minutes systematically dismantling Julien's confidence, suggesting that his interpretations of innocent interactions revealed a perverted mind that saw evil where none existed. He questioned Julien's spiritual maturity, his understanding of appropriate mentoring relationships, and his loyalty to organizational leadership. By the end of the conversation, Julien found himself apologizing for his misunderstandings and promising to be more careful about judging the actions of his spiritual superiors. "I left that meeting feeling completely defeated and confused," Julien admitted. "Morrison had managed to make me question everything I thought I had witnessed. He was so convincing, so authoritative, so skilled at turning my concerns back on me, that I began wondering if I really had misinterpreted innocent mentoring sessions as something sinister. The guilt and shame I felt for even harboring such thoughts about a respected circuit overseer was overwhelming. For several months following the confrontation, Julian tried to convince himself that Morrison's explanations were sufficient and that his own suspicions had been unfounded. He threw himself into congregation activities with renewed vigor, determined to demonstrate his loyalty and spiritual maturity. But the doubts never completely disappeared, especially when he continued observing Marcus's deteriorating emotional state and increasingly withdrawn behavior. The breaking point came 6 months later during a circuit assembly when Morrison delivered a powerful talk about protecting children from worldly influences and maintaining the moral purity of God's organization. As Julian watched hundreds of congregation members applauding enthusiastically for this man they viewed as a pillar of righteousness, he felt physically ill knowing what he suspected about Morrison's private conduct with vulnerable young people. After the assembly, I overheard Marcus's mother speaking with another sister about her son's continued behavioral problems, Julian recalled. She mentioned that he had begun refusing to attend meetings, claiming he felt sick whenever they approached the Kingdom Hall. She was considering seeking professional counseling, but other congregation members were discouraging her from involving worldly psychologists who might plant dangerous ideas in the boy's mind. That conversation crystallized Julian's understanding that his silence was enabling continued abuse while an innocent child suffered in isolation. Regardless of Morrison's threats and manipulation, regardless of the potential consequences for his own position in the organization, he could no longer pretend that his concerns were unfounded or that the situation would resolve itself naturally. He began documenting everything he could remember about the incidents he had witnessed, writing detailed accounts with specific dates, times, and circumstances. He researched organizational policies regarding allegations against appointed men, studying the official procedures outlined in elder manuals and correspondence from the branch office. Most importantly, he began reaching out carefully to other elders and longtime congregation members, asking subtle questions about whether anyone else had noticed changes in Marcus's behavior or had concerns about the mentoring program. What I discovered during those conversations terrified me even more than my original suspicions, Julian said. 2 other elders admitted privately that they had noticed Marcus's distress, but had assumed it was normal adjustment difficulties for a boy from a broken home. One sister mentioned that her teenage daughter had confided concerns about seeing Marcus crying in the bathroom after private meetings with Brother Morrison. Another family revealed that their son had mentioned feeling uncomfortable about some of the questions Morrison asked during their own mentoring sessions. The pattern of evidence that emerged from Julian's careful inquiries painted a picture far more disturbing than his initial observations had suggested. What he had witnessed with Marcus was not an isolated incident, but part of a systematic pattern of inappropriate behavior that had been occurring under the protective cover of Morrison's respected position and the organization's unquestioning trust in appointed leadership. The revelation that other children had experienced similar discomfort during mentoring sessions with Morrison confirmed Julian's worst fears and created an urgent moral crisis that demanded immediate action. Armed with this additional information, Julian made the difficult decision to approach Brother Kenneth Palmer, the congregation's presiding overseer and a man he had known and respected for over a decade. Palmer was considered one of the most spiritually mature elders in their circuit, known for his fairness, wisdom, and genuine concern for the welfare of congregation members. If anyone could be trusted to handle such serious allegations appropriately, Julian believed it would be Brother Palmer. The meeting took place on a Saturday morning at Palmer's home, away from the Kingdom Hall where their conversation might be overheard or interrupted. Julian had prepared extensively, organizing his documentation and rehearsing how to present the information in a way that would be taken seriously without appearing to be motivated by personal animosity or jealousy toward Morrison's elevated position. He understood that accusations against circuit overseers required extraordinary substantiation and could have far-reaching consequences throughout the organizational hierarchy. Brother Palmer listened intently as I presented everything I had witnessed and learned, Julian recounted. His expression grew increasingly grave as I detailed the specific incidents, the changes in Marcus's behavior, and the concerning reports from other families about their children's experiences with Morrison's mentoring program. When I finished my presentation, he sat in silence for several minutes, clearly processing the magnitude of what I had shared. Palmer's initial response seemed encouraging. He thanked Julian for bringing such serious concerns to his attention and assured him that protecting children was the organization's highest priority. He asked detailed questions about dates, witnesses, and documentation, taking careful notes and requesting copies of Julian's written accounts. He explained the official procedures for investigating allegations against appointed men and promised that the matter would be handled with appropriate seriousness and discretion. He told me that he would need to consult with the other elders in our body and possibly contact the branch office for guidance on how to proceed with such sensitive allegations. Julian continued. He emphasized the importance of following organizational protocols precisely to ensure that justice was served while protecting the congregation from unnecessary turmoil. I left that meeting feeling hopeful that finally someone with authority and influence was taking my concerns seriously. But the days that followed brought increasingly troubling developments. Instead of the discreet investigation Palmer had promised, Julian began noticing subtle changes in how he was treated by other elders and prominent congregation members. Conversations would stop abruptly when he entered rooms. Longtime friends seemed distant and uncomfortable in his presence, and his assignments for congregation responsibilities were quietly reduced without explanation. 2 weeks after his meeting with Palmer, Julian received an unexpected phone call requesting his immediate presence at an emergency meeting of the body of elders. When he arrived at the Kingdom Hall that evening, he found all 6 elders seated around the conference table with expressions ranging from disappointment to barely concealed hostility. Palmer, who had seemed so supportive during their private conversation, now appeared cold and formal as he explained the purpose of the gathering. "Brother Julian," Palmer began, "we've received very disturbing reports about your recent conduct and statements regarding Brother Morrison. It has been brought to our attention that you have been spreading unsubstantiated accusations against a respected circuit overseer, questioning the judgment of organizational leadership and attempting to undermine the faith of other congregation members through your unfounded suspicions and conspiracy theories." The betrayal was complete and devastating. Palmer had not only failed to investigate Julian's concerns, but had apparently shared the information directly with Morrison, who had then used his influence to reframe the entire situation as an attack on organizational authority rather than legitimate concerns about child welfare. The elders had been convinced that Julian was a troublemaker whose accusations posed a threat to congregation unity and respect for appointed leadership. They told me that Brother Morrison had contacted them personally to express his concerns about my mental and spiritual state, Julian recalled, his voice breaking with remembered anguish. According to their account, Morrison was worried that I was developing paranoid delusions and anti-organizational attitudes that could spread to other congregation members if left unchecked. He had positioned himself as the concerned spiritual father, trying to help a troubled young elder rather than the predator I was attempting to expose. The meeting continued for over 3 hours as the elders systematically dismantled Julian's credibility and questioned his motives for making such serious accusations. They suggested that his interpretations of innocent interactions reflected a troubled mindset that saw evil where none existed. They questioned his spiritual maturity, his understanding of appropriate authority relationships, and his loyalty to organizational leadership. Most devastatingly, they implied that his allegations themselves constituted serious sins that required formal discipline. Brother Richardson, one of the most senior elders, told me that spreading false accusations against appointed men was a form of apostasy that could result in disfellowshipping. Julian continued. He said that my behavior showed dangerous independent thinking and rebellion against theocratic order. They gave me two choices: publicly apologize for my false accusations and accept whatever disciplinary measures they deemed appropriate, or face a judicial committee that would almost certainly result in my removal from all positions and possible expulsion from the congregation. The manipulation was complete. The organizational structure that was supposed to protect innocent members had instead been weaponized to silence legitimate concerns about abuse. Morrison's position and influence had transformed him from suspected predator into victim of false accusations, while Julian's attempts to protect children had been reframed as attacks on sacred institutional authority. But the most crushing blow came when Palmer privately revealed the extent of Morrison's influence over the situation. After the other elders had left, Palmer asked Julian to remain for a final conversation. His demeanor softened slightly as he explained that he personally found some of Julian's concerns troubling and worthy of investigation, but that the decision to proceed had been taken out of their hands by higher authorities. Brother Morrison had contacted the district overseer immediately after learning about my allegations, Julian explained. The district overseer had then instructed our body of elders that any investigation of Morrison would need to be conducted at the circuit level, effectively removing local control over the situation. But more importantly, they were told that unsubstantiated accusations against circuit overseers could damage the organization's reputation and weaken faith throughout the entire district if not handled with extreme caution. Palmer revealed that the branch office had been consulted and had advised that allegations against appointed men required multiple eyewitnesses to specific acts of wrongdoing before formal investigations could proceed. Since Julian's evidence consisted primarily of suspicious circumstances and behavioral observations rather than direct testimony from victims, the case was deemed insufficient to warrant official action. The institutional machinery designed to protect leadership from false accusations had effectively made it impossible to investigate legitimate concerns about abuse. The most heartbreaking part was when Palmer told me that even if my suspicions were correct, pursuing the matter further would likely cause more harm than good, Julian said. He explained that public accusations against Morrison would create scandal, weaken faith, and potentially drive people away from the organization. He said that sometimes protecting the greater good required allowing individual injustices to remain hidden, trusting that Jehovah would eventually bring all wrongdoing to light in his own time and way. The conversation ended with Palmer's gentle but firm suggestion that Julian accept the elders' decision and focus on rebuilding his reputation within the congregation. He was offered the opportunity to remain as an elder if he agreed to stop pursuing his allegations and accepted counseling to address his apparent spiritual and emotional problems. The alternative was to continue fighting an unwinnable battle that would inevitably result in his complete destruction within the organization he had devoted his adult life to serving. That night, sitting alone in my living room after Julian had finished his devastating account, I felt as though the foundation of my entire worldview had cracked beyond repair. Everything I had believed about the organization's commitment to protecting the innocent, everything I had trusted about the integrity of our leadership structure, everything I had built my identity upon for over 2 decades lay in ruins around me. But Julian's story was far from over, and what he revealed next would force me to confront the most difficult decision of my entire life. 3 days after the elders had delivered their ultimatum, Julian found an unmarked envelope slipped under his apartment door. Inside were photocopied documents that would later prove to be the missing pieces of a horrifying puzzle that extended far beyond his observations about Morrison's behavior with Marcus. The envelope contained correspondence between Morrison and various branch office officials dating back over 8 years, documenting a pattern of complaints and concerns about his conduct with young people that had been systematically covered up and dismissed. Brother Thomas, what I discovered in those documents destroyed any remaining hope I had that the organization was capable of protecting children from predators within its ranks, Julian said, his voice heavy with exhaustion and grief. There were letters from parents in 3 different congregations expressing concerns about Morrison's inappropriate interest in their sons. There were reports from elders who had witnessed troubling behavior but had been counseled to remain silent for the good of the organization. Most damning of all, there was correspondence from a former circuit overseer who had attempted to warn the branch office about Morrison's conduct and had subsequently been removed from his position for causing divisions. The documentation revealed that Morrison's pattern of abuse had been known to organizational leadership for nearly a decade, but each incident had been handled as an isolated concern rather than part of a larger pattern requiring systematic investigation. Parents who complained were counseled about the importance of trusting appointed men and not allowing Satan to use their concerns to create dissension. Elders who reported suspicious behavior were reminded about the sacred nature of organizational unity and the dangers of spreading unsubstantiated rumors about faithful servants. Most heartbreaking were the handwritten letters from victims themselves, young men now in their 20s who had attempted to report abuse they had suffered years earlier. Their accounts described the same pattern of manipulation, threats, and spiritual coercion that Julian had witnessed with Marcus. Each letter detailed how their attempts to seek help had been dismissed, minimized, or turned back on them as evidence of spiritual weakness or rebellious attitudes. One letter was from a young man named David, who had been abused by Morrison when he was 14 years old, Julian continued. He described how Morrison had used private Bible studies to groom him, gradually introducing inappropriate physical contact as part of spiritual instruction about biblical manhood. When David finally found courage to tell his parents, they reported the matter to their local elders, who assured them it would be handled appropriately. Instead, David and his family were marked as troublemakers. Their social standing in the congregation was destroyed, and they eventually left the organization entirely. The anonymous source had also included photographs that appeared to have been taken covertly during Morrison's visits to various congregations. The images showed him in private settings with young boys, his body language and positioning suggesting inappropriate intimacy that confirmed the written accounts. While not explicitly depicting criminal acts, the photographs provided visual evidence of grooming behavior and boundary violations that supported the victims' testimonies. But perhaps most disturbing was a memorandum from the branch office legal department discussing strategies for managing allegations against Morrison without creating liability for the organization. The document outlined procedures for discouraging victims from seeking outside help, methods for protecting organizational reputation during investigations, and techniques for minimizing financial exposure in potential lawsuits. The welfare of abused children was mentioned only in the context of preventing them from becoming sources of negative publicity. Reading those documents, I realized that my situation with Morrison was not an isolated incident requiring individual courage, but part of a systematic problem that demanded institutional reform, Julian explained. The organization had created a structure that protected predators while silencing victims, and my choice was no longer simply about maintaining my position as an elder or protecting my reputation within the congregation. It was about whether I could continue participating in a system that I now knew was actively enabling child abuse. Julian made copies of all the documents and spent several sleepless nights deciding how to proceed. He considered taking the evidence to local police, but worried that law enforcement might be reluctant to investigate decades-old allegations against a religious leader without direct cooperation from victims who had been systematically discouraged from speaking publicly. He contemplated approaching news media, but feared that sensationalized coverage might actually harm the victims by exposing them to unwanted attention and scrutiny. Ultimately, he decided on a course of action that would prove both courageous and costly. He compiled a comprehensive report documenting Morrison's pattern of abuse, the organizational cover-up, and the systemic failures that had enabled years of criminal behavior to continue unchecked. He sent copies to every member of the branch office committee, every district and circuit overseer in the region, and every body of elders in congregations where Morrison had served. I knew that sending those documents would end my life as one of Jehovah's Witnesses, Julian said, but I also knew that remaining silent would make me complicit in future abuse of children who trusted the organization to protect them. The choice between personal safety and moral responsibility was agonizing, but ultimately not difficult at all. The response was swift and devastating. Within 48 hours of distributing his report, Julian received notification that he was being summoned before a judicial committee to answer charges of apostasy, slander, and causing divisions within God's organization. The committee consisted of 3 elders from neighboring congregations who had already been briefed by Morrison himself about Julian's mental instability and history of making false accusations. The judicial hearing was a predetermined conclusion rather than a genuine investigation. The elders refused to examine Julian's documentation, dismissing it as forged evidence created by disgruntled former members and enemies of the organization. They focused instead on his violation of organizational loyalty and his refusal to accept the wisdom of appointed leadership. When Julian attempted to present testimony from other witnesses, he was told that hearsay and rumors were not acceptable evidence in theocratic proceedings. They disfellowshipped me that same evening, Julian concluded. 23 years of faithful service, countless hours of voluntary work, genuine love for the friends and the organization ended with a brief announcement that I was no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses. My family was instructed to cut off all contact with me. My friends were forbidden from acknowledging my existence, and my entire social support system disappeared overnight. But Julian's courage in speaking out had consequences that extended far beyond his personal destruction. Several victims who had remained silent for years found strength in his example and began speaking publicly about their experiences with Morrison. News media picked up the story, and law enforcement agencies in multiple states opened investigations into allegations spanning decades of abuse. Most importantly, Morrison's pattern of predatory behavior was finally exposed, ending his access to potential victims and beginning a process of accountability that the organization had refused to provide. As Julian finished his account, I sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of what I had learned. My first instinct was to doubt, to find reasons why his story couldn't be entirely accurate, to protect my faith in the organization that had given meaning to my entire adult life. But the documentation he showed me, the consistency of his account, and the ring of truth in his voice made denial impossible. I realized that I was facing the same choice that had confronted Julian years earlier. I could ignore what I had learned, protect my position and reputation, and trust that organizational leadership would eventually address any problems that might exist. Or I could act on the knowledge that children were being harmed while institutional structures protected their abusers from accountability. That night, I made copies of everything Julian had shared with me. I spent the following weeks researching, investigating, and confirming details of his account, and when I could no longer deny the truth of what I had discovered, I made the most difficult decision of my life. I chose justice over loyalty, children's safety over institutional reputation, and moral integrity over personal comfort. The consequences were exactly what Julian had warned me to expect. I lost everything I had worked for over 23 years of faithful service. But for the first time in my adult life, I sleep peacefully at night, knowing that I chose to protect the innocent rather than the institution that had failed them. To everyone who has listened to this difficult story, thank you for allowing me to share this burden that I have carried alone for too long. If any of you have experienced similar struggles between institutional loyalty and moral responsibility, I want you to know that you are not alone. If you have found strength in hearing about our choices to speak truth despite the cost, please share your own experiences in the comments below. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is remind each other that courage is possible, even when it costs us everything we thought we valued. Your support through subscribing and sharing these conversations means more than you could know, because it helps create a community where truth-telling is valued over comfortable silence. Together, we can ensure that protecting the innocent always takes priority over protecting institutions, no matter how sacred they may seem.